Today we're going to learn to position our controls in our user interface and assign constraints to them so that regardless of what iOS device they're running on and regardless of the orientation that it's running in, the controls will align themselves and look properly. So to start, we're going to open Xcode and create a new project. We still want to stay in single view application for now. And we're going to give our project a name. I'm just going to call mine Auto Layout Test. You want to make sure you're still in the Swift language and your device is still iPhone. Click Next and go ahead and click Create. Now we're working with the storyboard because we're setting up the UI, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And I'm going to go ahead and change the Winnie Any, even though because of what we're doing, we're assigning constraints, it really doesn't matter. But just because it takes up less screen space, I choose these two boxes just so I can get more stuff on my screen. Now I'm going to go ahead and start setting this up. The first thing I want to do is add a label, and I'm going to put this label at the top of my form, and I want the text in it just to be the name of my project. And I need to stretch the control just wide enough to see all the text in it. After that, I want to put a text box below that. So I'm going to go drag that over here. And I want to type a placeholder in this text box, text that lets the user know what I'm expecting them to type in there. And I do that right here. So I'm going to put enter your name. And you can see that shows up over here. We need to stretch the box so that it shows up. And this is the type text that once they start entering anything in here, this text disappears and accepts what they're putting in. I want to put a button underneath that. So let's go grab a button. And we're going to put it right underneath here. And I want this to say submit, so I'm going to type submit on it. And of course I'll have to stretch it out so that all the text will show up. And then I want to add another label. This one's where the message is going to go when they hit the submit button. So I will go ahead and type some text in it just so it shows up. And say message goes here. Or let's say message will display here. And let's stretch this out so that we can see all of the text. Okay, now I kind of want to move it back over to the center. I want to add a couple of more labels that aren't going to be centered, so I can show you how to set the constraints on those so that they move properly even though they're not centered. So we're going to put one label against this border, and we're going to put another label lined up with that one against this border. I'm not going to put anything in there. I'm using them to show you how to make them attach themselves to the borders rather than the center of the form. Now that I've got all my controls, I'm ready to go start setting my constraints on them. I want to start with the one at the very top of the form because everything else under it's going to align itself based on that one. So we're going to go start with this label, and I want us to be able to see what's happening while we're doing this. So first I want to turn off these two things on the sides, go to my Butler view, and in this second window I can choose right here to see a preview. This preview gives me an idea of what this is going to look like when it runs on an iOS device, and the iOS device you can see that it chose by default. For mine was this 4-inch iPhone. This way I don't have to actually execute the code and open the simulator to see what it's going to look like. I get an idea right here while I'm working on it. So I'm going to leave that open, and let's go start with our label. I'm going to click this second tool down here in this toolbar at the bottom. It pulls up the constraint window, and I know that I want to keep this control this distance from the top of my user interface. And in order to do that, I need to click on this little orange line right here. And I also know that I want to keep this width and this height because my text is displaying nicely now. So we'll check that and that. And then we're going to go and say, add those three constraints. You can see over here in this window what happened. It's distanced correctly from the top of the user interface, but it's not centered, and we want it centered. So in order to make that happen, while this control is still selected, we want to go over here and click this first tool down here in the toolbar. It's the Align tool. And we want to choose this option down here towards the bottom, the horizontal center in container. Check that checkbox and click Add One Constraint. And you can see over here it centered itself. And you can flip the orientation down here and see that this stays centered and that distance from the top, regardless of our orientation. Okay. Now to start setting the restraints for your other controls, select the next one and click on your second tool down in the toolbar again. This time, this control is going to set itself in relation with this one. So this 26 here says this is the distance it wants to keep it from this control, not from the top, but from this control. And that's good. We like this distance, so we're going to go ahead and select the little orange line to keep it. And again, we still want to keep our width and height the same. And we're going to add that constraint. And here again, you see it's not centered, but it's where it should be vertically. Now we're going to go click on the first button and click horizontal center in container as we did the first time. Add that constraint, and you'll see it move to the center. We're going to repeat the same steps for the submit button. And you can see here it says it's 23 from this control. If we want it to be the same distance from this one to this one, let's set that as a constraint and type in 26. And I want to keep the height and the width. No, went back to 26, 23. Okay, now it's 26. And I set my height and my width, and I'm going to add those three constraints. So you can see it's going to move it because it says it needs to move 3 more places down in order to be 26 away from here. So that's why I put the little 3 there, and that's okay. Now we want to center it. So we're going to click horizontal center in container, add that constraint. You see it got centered. And let's go repeat it with this control. Highlight it, click the second button, click your little orange I-beam, and then type in 26. Click on one of these others so that it stays there. Then check your width and your height and add these 3 constraints. You'll see again it's going to have to move it 4 pixels in order to get it in the position we told it we wanted it in. Now we're going to go center it. So we're going to click the first control and check horizontal center in container. Now we can see these are all lined up nicely. They're all going to be the same distance apart. And now we're going to work with these two. Now because these two aren't centered and they're not directly under these, we can't set their top based on this control, and we can't center them because we don't want them to be centered. We want them to be off to the sides. So we're going to set them up a little differently. And if you look over at your preview right now, you can see the first label, but this second one is so far over here that it doesn't even show up when we run this, when we would run the iPhone. It would be off. So let's set up the first one, the one we can see. Again, we're still going to go down here and we're going to click this second tool. We do still want to align the top, because if we don't, this could float up and down the screen and maybe end up beside one of our other controls, or, you know, out of sight by going too far down. But you'll notice this time it is actually aligning it with the top, because it's got 222 in here. So this one, that's how far it is from this top of our UI. So let's set that. But we also want to set the left side so that it stays to the left, and we do that by clicking this orange line. Again, we probably still want to keep the width and the height. Now we've got 4 constraints. Now we don't need to go back and center because we're not doing that. We lined this up with this one. Let's go repeat the same process with this one. Again, we can see it's 222, so it's exactly in line with this one, which is what we want. But this time we're connecting it to the left border, the right border. So we're going to click this button right here and check width and height and add those 4 constraints. And if you'll look over here, suddenly now you can see your label in this window. Now, this all looks good. Let's see what happens when I change my orientation. So let's go flip the iPhone and look what happens. The things that I told it to stay centered, stay center, and my labels stay touched to the sides. Some of these look a little off, and I'm going to show you why. This one especially looks like it's a little off. Let's go back to our design window over here, and let's open up our properties again. The problem is I didn't tell it to center this text within the control that it's in. It's left aligned. I want to center that. And I want to do that with each one of these so that they're centered. Not that one, but that. Well, I don't know if we'll center the text box. We'll probably leave it left aligned, but we need to center the title. Okay. So now let's turn that off. And now you can see message will display here. Looks more centered with the auto layout. So that's why it looked a little off before. And we can sit here and flip back and forth and see they just move where they need to be based on the constraints we gave them. Now we could set constraints for these 2 right here. Instead of being against these borders, we could set this one with a constraint to be so far away from that border, and this one to have a constraint, making it within a certain distance between this one, which would mean it wouldn't go up against this border, but it would keep its same distance away from this one. But because these are centered and these are not, it probably would look funny when we changed our orientation. And I'll just give you an example and show you. We'll go in here and to delete a restraint, if you've added one and you didn't want it, you can go in here and say, I want to keep this one because it's definitely, I want to keep it 222 from the top. That's my top constraint. This one down here keeps the width, and this one keeps the height. It's the one, if I drag it off, it's this one. See the orange one that says -45 away from there? This is the one I want to get rid of. So I'm just going to highlight that line and hit the delete key. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to say this time I want to align it on the left, which means it's going to be this number of pixels away from this control. If I set that and say add that one constraint, It's going to keep it this far down, this far over from that control, and you can see my width and my height are still there. The problem is, because that was my constraint and this distance is so far over to the right side, it disappeared on my iPhone when it's in portrait view. If I flip it to landscape view, it shows back up, but it wasn't attached to this border. It was lined up with this control, so it looks a little off. So that's why I prefer not to line these controls up that are going to end up over here with controls over here, because they look funny in both views, actually, because in one it disappears and in one it's just looks weird. So we're going to go back and delete that. This is the constraint we want to delete. Just click on it. Let me make sure that was the one. It looked like it got flipped when I did that. Click on that, hit delete. Select the control again and go back in here and tell it you want it to be lined up with that border. Now it's back to where we can see it there. And when we change our orientation, it just moves over and looks better in portrait. So that's how you can add and delete constraints. You just have to keep in mind that you have to have your user interface laid out before you start this, because this control is placed here based on where this control is, and this one, so on. So if I move one of these or I delete one of these, it changes what happens to the ones below it, and it causes problems. Let's just go delete the submit button, and I'll show you what happens so you can see. I'm just going to take it off of there. Because this control right here, the constraint for its top was based on it being 26 pixels away from the bottom of the submit button, but we took the submit button away, so now it can't do that. Look where it moved it to. It just moved it to the very top of the UI because it doesn't have a top constraint, so it doesn't know where to go. That's why this is very important, that you don't start setting constraints on your controls until you have your form laid out exactly the way you want it. This is where planning needs to come in, and you probably need to sit down with a sheet of paper and draw your form first, and to make sure you've got everything on it that you want, and then start building it. Okay.